English translation, 646th contact Wednesday, the 3rd of March 2016, 14:26 hours.
Sorry, I had to do something for Eva about a book. Greetings and welcome again.
The few minutes did not cause a problem. Thank you for your welcome and your greetings again.
It was good that the correction work was done so quickly, because the work Bernadette did is about 11 pages, she said. Look here in the computer. Wait, yes, look here. This is her work.
Have you read it yet?
No, I wanted to do it together with you, and also immediately pay attention to spelling mistakes, if it should have such.
Well, let's do it together.
Of course.
The whole thing is kept to a reasonable extent and within good limits and says everything I think that needs to be mentioned. Of course, there would still be a lot to say about your life, your way of life, and everything that has come up in many ways regarding your activities and private things from your childhood until today, and in all the countries where you have worked or simply traveled. But that does not belong here but in your biography, which Bernadette and you should finally tackle.
We have wanted to do that for a long time, but so far we have always been stopped from doing it because of other work. But now we've decided that when Bernadette is done with the work you want her to do, we will get behind the biography work.
That is good, because it should not be put off any longer. Although I know that the two of you are most burdened with the basic production of books and all writings, your biography should finally be taken into regular work, because...
That is also clear to us because time does not stand still.
That is true, and the whole thing is a great and extensive task that I alone trust Bernadette to carry out and complete.
Then we have the same views and thoughts in this regard. But we'll turn to the biography as soon as Bernadette has done the work you asked her to do.
Of course, and I'm counting on it. And it would be good if she could get on quickly with the work, which of course I want to take a look at.
Sure, she knows that. And I suppose everything has been said and clarified in this respect, so I can certainly turn to a few questions, can I?
Of course.
All right, thanks. Here's the deal. As you have told me several times in the course of our conversation since 1975, the pear or avocado fruit was already genetically manipulated more than 13,500 years ago by extraterrestrials or by Playaran immigrants in the tropical regions of Earth, and called pear by the people of that time, because the fruit was also used for feeding pigs. So there was a cultivation of naturally genetically modified avocados, which have been used as food by humans ever since. That is not in itself anything objectionable, but it is idiotic that genetically manipulated food should be ostracized, which I said something about at the 292nd contact on the 29th of September 2000, when there was talk of genetic manipulation. However, I am not talking about plant foods that have been chemically or radiatively genetically manipulated by industry, etc., but about those that come about through natural and completely natural genetic manipulation. This is where I copied what I said back then. Unfortunately, we still have a lot of ill-thinking human beings who cry out against genetic engineering and thus impede progress in this area. These opponents of genetic engineering are, in particular, the so-called Greens, who in their effeminate and stupid nature and in their fear stand in the way of inevitable progress. Using idiotic arguments, they boycott existing gene products and thus destroy decades of research into their effects. Genetically manipulated food, fruits and vegetables and cereals, etc., are burned up, and the claim that they are pathogenic is attached to them, etc. And all this in the ignorance that progress cannot be stopped despite all this, and that genetic engineering and genetic manipulation can remedy much, even a great deal of misery in the world, not only in the medical and life-prolonging field, but also in terms of better quality of the food that can be grown and otherwise produced, its longer shelf life and resistance to pests, etc. The idiotic hooligans against genetic engineering and genetic manipulation are, in my opinion, not just stupid and dumb in their thinking and understanding. They do not even have their own opinion on the whole thing, because the rule is this: that as puppets they are only imitating those brain-damaged idea-bringers who invent nonsense about the alleged danger of genetic engineering, genetic manipulation, and genetically modified food. And with their diseased brains give birth to ideas according to which genetically modified fruits, vegetables, as well as cereals, etc., are to be used to produce food, etc., are supposed to be dangerous and disease-causing. Of course, there is always the possibility that the natural fertilization of wind or insects may affect the seeds of other plants, which may lead to mutations, etc. But this process has been taking place in the wild for millions of years, because otherwise there would be no progress in the plant world, and consequently no new and more resistant plants could develop, adapted to progressive and constantly renewing life. But this also refers to the animal world, in which gene changes also take place naturally, whereby the animals also adapt themselves constantly to the new life, while man slowly becomes more and more atrophied, softened and incapable of procreation, because he sterilizes his life and body as well as the whole food, etc. more and more and changes them by all kinds of chemical poisons. And when I think of the fact that you told me years ago that the Earth humans have been eating genetically modified things for many thousands of years that have been genetically manipulated by extraterrestrials, such as the pear or the avocado fruit, then you could get a screaming cramp from laughter. All the more so as many foods have already been genetically modified for 25 years and are also eaten by opponents of genetic engineering without hesitation, just because they do not know that they eat genetically modified food. Well, that brings me to the point that various people complain to me time and again that genetic manipulation of food is demonstrably harmful to human health and even seriously ill, which is of course true when it comes to chemical genetic manipulation. And this is exactly what we have always talked about in our conversations, referring to all natural genetic manipulations, such as the phrase in which gene modifications also take place naturally. The whole thing was also expressed in this way, but unfortunately it was obviously not understandable enough for various people on Earth, which is why I want to take up this matter another time. Unfortunately, the phrase, gene changes in a natural way, has not been and is not understood by some readers of the contact reports. So they assume that we, you Playaran and I, would advocate chemical genetic manipulation, which poses a great danger to humans, fauna and flora, and causes health damage to all forms of life. So it is not the case that we approve of this genetic manipulation. Because if we approve of genetic manipulation, then this means only that which is carried out in a completely correct, natural way. It is also sometimes misunderstood that the avocado fruit can also be eaten by humans and is also a good food. For my part, I do not like it, at least not unprocessed, because I find it somehow disgusting in its raw state, when it's unprocessed, bland, and inedible for me. Processed and mixed with other things, as it must be, it is, however, quite acceptable and enjoyable, and as far as I know it is also healthy, and consequently also good and valuable as a former drinking fodder fruit for humans.
That is so, yes, indeed, because the fruit is really a good food for human beings if it is properly processed and prepared. What is not good, however, is the case of chemical genetic manipulation, because we cannot advocate chemical genetic manipulation, but only natural genetic manipulation, which takes place without any chemistry or radiation, but only through purely natural dynamic changes in the plants, completely natural and without chemical genetic engineering. The chemical and radiation-based genetic engineering processes are fundamentally at odds with natural processes and any natural gene modification process. In particular, the wild introduction of genes into the DNA of a plant leads to dangerous changes because the gene is inserted into the DNA at a completely random location. The relevant selection processes for plant varieties are therefore a very responsible task which does not allow genetic engineering to be carried out with chemical and radiation-based means. It should be noted that in plants, the genes in each chromosome of a cell are arranged one behind the other in a single long DNA molecule. In total, there are several thousand genes coding for the proteins or programming the natural code of the plant and causing a transformation of the information, so to speak, into a different and understandable form for the plant, which can also be called informative gene language. Between these protein-coding genes, there are regulatory sequences, which in turn control the entire function of the genes. In natural genetic manipulation, a so-called sexual process takes place, which primarily serves to multiply the plants, whereby the paternal and maternal chromosomes are distributed among the offspring. Each descendant plant has from each chromosome 2 of which are inherited from the maternal and paternal plant. In the natural normal case, during the development of the germ cells or during the formation of the pollen and the egg cell, there is an exchange of pieces between the paternal and maternal chromosomes, which means a crossover. This results in a redistribution of the paternal and maternal chromosomes during natural and sexual reproduction. Crossing over the chromosomes also causes a new combination between the chromosomes, and consequently both paternal and maternal characteristics appear within a chromosome. So this crossover means that parts of the paternal DNA connect to the maternal DNA. The transition from the paternal to the maternal DNA sequence takes place by pure joining. And then, for example, everything can also take place within a protein-coding gene. This makes it possible for a new gene variant to develop in a completely natural way, which then naturally contains parts of the paternal and also the maternal gene. This also means that mutations arise in the DNA, whose molecule is made up of 4 different building blocks and whose sequence is the DNA sequence. It is this DNA sequence that firstly determines the structure of the proteins and secondly controls the function of the genes as a regulatory sequence. The DNA molecules are copied so that the chromosomes and thus the DNA can be passed on to the germ cells. This process is not absolutely perfect. Consequently, errors or mutations can occur in the newly created DNA. Individual building blocks can then be exchanged, which is referred to as point mutation, or some areas are missing. Consequently, a deletion takes place, but there is also the possibility that pieces of DNA are introduced and therefore an insertion takes place. Such mutations occur very frequently, and each plant's germ cell contains up to 50 or more new mutations. This means that these mutations are of course passed on to the offspring, so that they not only have the characteristics of the parent plants, but also new characteristics. The genes do not form a fixed static structure, but consist of an extremely dynamic system, and are a decisive driving force in evolution that allows the plant to adapt to a changing environment. The continuous genetic alterations occur entirely as a result of an assembly and often destroy the function of genes. If this affects a gene that is vital for the plant, it dies. Mutations in genes whose function is not vital may remain present for a long time. It is also a fact that the transfer of DNA to the offspring is associated with a great number of changes by chance, as a result of which many genetically different individuals can occur in a plant population comprising several million. This genetic diversity therefore results in a broad spectrum of different growth forms and a large number of biochemical properties. The diversity of the species of a plant population created by coincidence is very important for their survival, because among the different individuals there are many variants that can adapt again and again to changed conditions.
This is very interesting and certainly very far-reaching. But I think that something should be said about the artificial insertion of genes by chemical and radiative genetic engineering, which is nature unfriendly or unnatural. In contrast, this is the case when genetic manipulation takes place which, although it is an artificial process, nevertheless corresponds to natural genetic manipulation and does not cause any damage to humans, fauna, or flora. So the question is what to say about chemical and radiative gene manipulation.
Since chemical gene manipulation leads to the continuous destruction of individual genes as a result of the dynamics of genetic diversity, it must be said that the irresponsible actions of gene manipulators in genetically manipulated plants give rise to toxic substances that endanger the health of humans and the entire fauna and flora. Due to the continuous chemically produced genetic changes, traditional and completely new poisons are produced in the plants, which cause great health hazards for humans as well as for fauna and flora, and are therefore not harmless. How irresponsibly the genetic manipulators lie. Small amounts of natural toxins present in plants increase due to genetic changes and endanger the health of all living beings. One example is the potato, which contains small amounts of solanine, a toxic glycoalkaloid, with the solanine content increasing as a result of chemical gene manipulation, which is of course disputed and therefore does not prevent marketing authorization. The fact is that the chemical genetic manipulation of plants and their reproduction is associated with a continuous genetic alteration, which inevitably results in the destruction of individual genes by chance. It is also a fact that the artificial introduction of chemically treated genes into plants of all genera and species leads to dangerous changes. This is undeniable despite the lying denial of those responsible for genetic manipulation. Truth is also that every plant has a very large number of genetic alterations which also include insertions of DNA sequences. However, the genetic manipulation carried out by earthly genetic manipulators with regard to the introduction of genes to a random location is not comparable with the naturally occurring process of natural genetic manipulation. The process of introducing a gene in the aforementioned artificial chemical way undoubtedly leads to a novel change in the plant which is harmful to human health, fauna and flora, because it is fundamentally different from naturally occurring plants which are genetically modified in a natural way and which have been used by terrestrial humans for thousands of years in the selection of cultivated plants. With the techniques of natural genetic analysis, terrestrial man is absolutely in a position to create genetic changes in the plant world without having to carry out chemical genetic manipulations that endanger the health of humans, fauna and flora, or even life. The terrestrial man has the possibility to do in this respect what his ancestors have used and done during thousands of years in the continuous selection of optimal plant varieties.
That should be enough. And what if you can say something about the avocado fruit now? I'd like to know a few things about that.
I can do that because I know a lot about it. The normal, well-known food avocado is a pear-shaped butterfruit, which of course does not contain any real butter, but very much one of the healthiest fats, the avocado fat or fruit fat, which contains plenty of monounsaturated fatty acids. The fat of the avocado is able to regulate the cholesterol level. As you said, the avocado was genetically manipulated and cultivated in the tropical regions of Earth by Plejaren immigrants in a natural way over 13,500 years ago. Today, the healthy pear-shaped butterfruit also grows in the subtropics. The plant itself, the avocado tree, is very large and even giant when growing normally, although it has a lush foliage, and the avocado fruit, depending on the species, can itself be as small as a pear or reach the size of a handball. However, the large species are hardly marketed because they cannot be stored well and are not very popular, at least not in the industrialized countries. It should also be said that the avocados do not ripen on the tree, but if they do, it is extremely rare. Naturally, the fruits fall in still hard and unripe condition from the tree on the ground, where they only then ripen there. Many of them are naturally damaged by the impact on the ground, as a result of which they are quickly attacked by insects, eaten and filled with eggs, causing them to spoil and rot quickly, but they are also used as food by certain animals and creatures. As a result, avocados intended for consumption were picked directly from the tree at an early stage and stored until they were ripe or sent to all corners of the globe. Due to its high fat content, the avocado is not exactly highly valued by many people on Earth, as it has about 400 calories and 40 grams of fruit fat as a medium-sized fruit of about the size of a pear. Unfortunately, this makes many people on Earth shy away from turning to the avocado or the clean pear and preparing it as a good food. Basically, the avocado is also a healthy fruit, which contains valuable unsaturated fatty acids in its fruit fat, which are very digestible and very good for the human body and organism because they have a very positive effect on the blood fat level. It is also a fact that the high proportion of indigestible fibers even reduces the risk of cardiovascular diseases because the cholesterol level is lowered by the fruit fat. The avocado contains not only calories and fruit fat, but also a lot of fiber, as well as the important vitamin C, iron, folic acid, potassium, copper, and magnesium, which are extremely important for the body and organism. Avocados with vitamins A, C, and E, and many other ingredients also have a positive and improving effect on the skin and hair. In addition, the clean pear is also a good nerve food because a special carbohydrate combination ensures that nerves and brain cells are better supplied with the necessary energy, which reduces stress. It should also be said that the avocado provides twice as much energy as a banana and even 4 times as much as an apple.
But one thing's for sure, avocados make people put on weight, right? This is when I think of all the fruit fat.
Of course this is correct, because the flesh, and especially the high-calorie fruit fat it contains, does not make you slim, so you should not eat dozens of avocados a day. Nevertheless, the clean pears are very healthy and valuable and should also be used in diets when consumption is kept in bulk.
The conclusion would be that a healthy salad with a good avocado sauce is better than cheese, sausage, and bread, or a knuckle of pork with sauerkraut. Also, a bread with a deliciously prepared avocado spread is very good, as I have to say, because I ate it on my travels. The conclusion would be that a healthy salad with a good avocado sauce is better than cheese, sausage, and bread, or a knuckle of pork with sauerkraut. Also, a bread with a tasty avocado spread is very good, as I have to say, as I ate that on my travels. Especially good were specially spiced avocado spreads, like some spicy avocado herb creams, in which the bread was dipped.
I know that too.
Then I have a question concerning U.S. President Barack Obama, who, since his presidency, has changed into a completely different person. Could you please say something about this? Because we were glad in the first few years that this man became president and brought along good prerequisites for creating better order in various relations in the USA. But then he began to change and fell off his good path before his second term in office.
What you're saying is right, which is very unfortunate. The reason for his failure and his transformation lies in the fact that he lost his willpower and lost his goals from his senses and aspirations because of the all-round influence of his advisors, the military and the secret services, as well as other influencers, the Republicans working against him and people from his own party. So Obama was not strong enough to stay on his original line and with his plans, which he initially wanted to push through. The longer he was pressed and even threatened in his office by everyone, openly or underground, by false advice and demands, which of course never became apparent and probably never will, the more he became yielding to the demands made of him, following the open and also underhanded whispers and demands of the advisors, the military, the secret services, and other influencers, and began to act according to their will. Nevertheless, he tried and tries again and again when his old plans, etc., appear in his memories, to launch one thing or another, but such obstacles are put in his way to realization that he must fail. So he can only submit and act according to the will of those who know how to direct him according to their will. Thus, everything came as it is today, whereby his dream of the promised change never came true and will not come true. So during his term in office, he could achieve only very little, and also not the economic progress of the USA, propagated by him, as well as not the prohibition of torture and the Guantanamo penal camp worthy of human contempt. Today he is accused of this and many other things, and claims that he has broken his promises. But exactly this does not correspond to the truth, because he did not break his promises, but the fulfillment of these promises was made impossible to him by all his adversaries, who let him run into emptiness and destroyed his efforts to fulfill his good plans and the change for the better and for the good. Consequently, he could almost not enforce and realize anything of his promises. In the USA, in the EU dictatorship, as well as all over the world, he is now depicted as a failure and a promise breaker, ostracized and made guilty for everything that is criminally done by the USA henchmen in many countries of the world. And since he is forced to sign the corresponding actions and order how everything is dictated to him, he is personally held liable and even claims that he is worse than his murderous predecessor, George Walker Bush, in terms of violations of international law. And the reason for this is precisely because Barack Obama is compelled to sign everything that is presented to him for signature by hand, no matter whether by the military, the secret services, or those who steer him openly, deceitfully, or secretly. In this way, it is never the real failures that are to blame for everything, neither the governing parties, the secret services, the direct and indirect advisors, nor the secretly governing and powerful people around Barack Obama, who create unbelievable intrigues and direct the president according to their will.
They let him dance according to their will, deceive him to the letter, exploit him and deceive him in every way. And the bad thing about it is that he does not defend himself against it, because he knows exactly that otherwise he will be liquidated by the henchmen of those who rule him. And because he does not dare to defend himself, the backers always hold the reins, are absolutely safe and unknown to the outside world, while Barack Obama is accused of being a scapegoat and a bogeyman, and has to take the rap for all evil and crimes against humanity, and is held liable for the crimes committed by all the henchmen of the USA worldwide.
Had Obama known, and I have researched this very carefully, that he was being forcibly manipulated in his office by his advisors, the military powers and intelligence services, and all the others around him who determine military and state policy beyond him, before he made an effort to hold the U.S. presidency, he would never have made an effort to become president. Unfortunately, on the one hand, he is not fully aware of the whole thing either, because he follows the evil whispers. While on the other hand, he is aware that he simply has to do a lot to be deceitfully influenced, because he knows very well that this is the only way he can protect his own life and that of his family. If he would not act according to the will of those influencing him, who of course remain in the background, then he would not be alive for a long time, as his family might not be. This especially because Obama and his family are African Americans.
Somehow he seems to me to be a standing skipjack, because he always gets himself up again and again, in order to still be able to realize something of his old plans, which unfortunately goes wrong again and again, because his adversaries always blow everything away and have more power than him. Even if not everything is completely clear to him, that he is manipulated all around, as you say, but he has to perceive a lot in this respect, make a good face to the bad game, and be called in the USA and even worldwide as a bogeyman and failure. And this only because the lunatics who degrade him as a bogeyman and make him the scapegoat for all US-American atrocities in his own country and all over the world and insult him are not intelligent enough to recognize the effective truth. Consequently, he is also made liable for the drones in various countries, because the know-it-alls and enemies against Obama, like many journalists, etc., do not really look behind the scenes of the US government and therefore pick on Obama stupidly and primitively. And this because they are too stupid and dumb to know that he has to sign orders for this and that to protect himself and his family. At least that's how you put it anyway.
That is correct and also corresponds to reality. Basically, the man is powerless against all his adversaries around him who abuse him as a pusher and degrade him to a boogeyman, as you say.
The sneaky Obama-controlling elements around him I consider a secret power-hungry gang of criminals. And Obama cannot be equated with father and son Bush, who were both war criminals and still are, because they are still alive.
This is actually the case and corresponds to what really is.
Actually, Barack Obama should resign his office as U.S. president, because he is not the one who rules, but the underhanded and power-hungry gang of criminals around him.
Unfortunately, he cannot do that for various reasons, which I do not want to mention openly for the sake of his safety.
All right, then we better end this topic now and switch to the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, to whom I want to say that when I look at the German people, I recognize that she divides German society, as do the various racist organizations in Germany, especially the neo-Nazis and the Islamophobes, who are all an image of the DNSAP. Hitler and his companions send their regards. Merkel herself is lifted to heaven by her like-minded peers from all over Germany and the EU dictatorship, with all her followers not smart enough to realize that this woman is a dangerous psychopath who wants to destroy Germany. Your refugee policy is a good way of doing this, because it creates a completely false image of humanity and human love for many of the unneeded with regard to this woman. And it is precisely this fact that she uses treacherously. With the help of all her stupid followers, the hearers and those who circumvent her, to carry out her destructive work with regard to Germany and all EU states. They all let themselves be blinded and misled by her, because they are psychological zeros, cannot see behind her disguised facade, and cannot judge her actions either. And as we have already spoken several times about this woman, she is ill both in her consciousness and in her psyche, whereby an underlying hatred against Germany shapes her entire actions and behavior, which vengefully leads to the destruction of Germany and Europe, whereby as a Zionist she finds her profound reason for her hatred against Germany and Europe in the Holocaust of the last World War. And not only we know what is really going on with this woman, because other people also think about it, have certain psychological knowledge and the ability to judge it, so they also write about it in newspapers and journals and publish what they find. Especially at the present time, when the refugee welcome culture was set in motion by Chancellor Merkel's profound hate madness in order to overburden and collapse Germany and Europe. Various people appear in newspapers with articles to make their findings about this woman publicly known. As a result of her treacherous actions with regard to the welcome culture for refugees which she created, hundreds of thousands and even well over 1 million real refugees have immigrated to Europe, as have very many false refugees, such as economic refugees. Criminals, and sleeper killers of the Islamist State, the IS, which creates great problems and will in the future create much greater problems which can hardly be overcome or not at all. And this is caused by a woman who is psychically conscious and ill, who is internally torn apart and not able to assume her responsibility as federal chancellor. But others have also noticed this, as I already mentioned. For example, Gerhard Hess, Germany, who has published an apt article on the internet that names effective facts relating to Angela Merkel and which I incorporated yesterday into the Figu time sign No. 37. Here it is so you can read it.
Thanks. Yes, what is written here and the picture that goes with it say exactly what we two have often said and discussed. Unfortunately, however, there is nothing written about what the actual background of their actions to destroy the country is, as we were able to judge and carry out on the basis of our knowledge.
Strange woman A. Merkel.
The clinical picture of Angela Merkel with such fingernails is called onychophagy. Mrs. Merkel is a fingernail nibbler. Onychophagy, also called fingernail chewing, nail biting, is the chewing or eating up of fingernails, claws or claws in humans or animals. In humans, the heavier forms fall under the term self-harm, self-injurious behavior. while the lighter, nervous forms are not necessarily self-injurious. Triggers include behavioral disorders, dissatisfaction, the need to reduce tension in hypermotor activity, excessive demands and conflicts in everyday life, unexercised aggressiveness, the will to destroy, attempts to suppress malevolence, the will to harm oneself, and other emotional deformations, for example, primarily sexual disorders such as unexercised or inexercisable urges. Onychophagy can occur in neuroses, or together with an onychotillomania, which is the only sign of paranoid psychosis. The fact that Mrs. Merkel cannot be mentally healthy because she conjures up the Islamic alienation of Germany, and thus the predictable popular death of the Germans without compelling reason, is undeniable. In order to compensate her own insecurity and inner imbalance, that is to say, not to let the mental, spiritual note, psychological conscious instability be noticed if possible, Angela Merkel uses the rhombic handling, which wants to express exactly the opposite. The Merkel rhombus is a gesture of hiding that wants to deceive people about the true attitude of the person. Nail biting belongs to the forms of psychosis of self-injurious behavior, or autoaggressive behavior, or also of artifact action. A whole range of behaviors are described in which affected people intentionally inflict injuries or wounds on themselves. Such behaviors can serve the self-punishment with deep-seated self-hatred. It would be conceivable that A. Merkel, as the child of the theologian Horst Kasner, would develop a hatred of his father, triggered, for example, by an overly strict upbringing in the Christian communist parental home, which the Chancellor would live out in her will to kill the people entrusted to her. Self-injurious behavior can occur with borderline personality disorder, fetal alcohol syndrome, Lesch-Nyhan syndrome, depression, eating disorders such as anorexia nervosa or bulimia, obesity, abuse experience, deprivation, withdrawal of attention and nest warmth, traumatizations during puberty, loss of control, body schema disorders, body integrity, identity disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, severe resets and humiliations, psychotic or schizophrenic relapses, and similar mental disorders. Mental disorders as well as mental note conscious, disability and autism. Network info. In general, the focus is on informing the patient. In addition, in some cases, psychotherapy or local measures, such as the application of nail polish or other nasty tasting substances and the wearing of gloves and artificial fingernails, can be helpful. However, it is crucial for success that the measure is taken voluntarily and in consultation with the patient. With sheep, it is usual to separate aggressive animals from the young, and even to put down strongly damaged animals through onychophagy. Gerhard Hess, Germany.
To the whole, which Angela Merkel carries out in a devious and destructive way, also belong the powerful and intriguing USA, which also influence the imperialist dictatorship of the EU in a devious way through Merkel and incite against Russia and Putin, which wants to keep peace and also be helpful mediator, but which is stomped into the mud by the USA and Merkel, as well as the imperialist dictatorship of the EU. For my part, I think that Putin, as the leader of his own country, may be acting dictatorially in certain respects, but in foreign policy he has more Grütze, more intellect, and more reason in his head than Merkel and all of the US and EU dictatorship powers. This is also proven by the idiotic sanctions imposed by the USA and the EU dictatorship against Russia, for which Ukraine is a very good means to an end. And what goal the USA is pursuing, it is also clear that it consists of a comprehensive war, which they want to bring over Europe and which could quickly expand into a Fourth World War. There three have already been, if the First World War is also counted, which took place 1756-1763, but is only called a 7-year war, but was effectively a world war. So in the EU dictatorship, the USA, via Chancellor Merkel in particular, is stirring up the threat of disaster, with Russia being held liable as the scapegoat for the precarious political situation in Ukraine, which of course is complete nonsense. Ukraine has huge financial difficulties. It is clear, as it is clear, that the USA and the EU dictatorship are taking advantage of this and creeping into the country in order to one day assimilate it. But more specifically, the United States is interested in penetrating Europe and playing out its power, with a vicious war being the appropriate means if that were to happen. The fact is, as you have already told me several times privately, that the long-term basic goal of the USA is to bring all of Europe and Russia, and ultimately the whole world, under its thumb, and thus to subjugate and profit from it endlessly and with violence and coercion. The warlords of the USA do not give a damn about human lives, because they are effectively going over dead bodies, regardless of whether they are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions. The European and US media of all kinds also help in this, and with them irresponsible journalists who twist all facts and deceive the readership with false reports and fictitious factual reports. But in addition to these, it is also the various power-hungry parties, as well as the business community, especially the arms industry, which are irresponsible accomplices of the state leaders of the USA and the EU dictatorship, etc., who mislead the populations with suggestive persuasions and prepare them for war. And if such a thing is provoked by the USA and the EU dictatorship, then it will crack enormously, because then Russia will be forced to resist and will not be averse to showing its strength as a well-equipped nuclear power, which would then fulfill the prophecy that Europe would perish in nuclear fire and that the USA would also suffer a similar fate. And the fact that such a war is provoked by the USA and the EU dictatorship is beyond doubt, because both are completely crazy and completely overtaxed in terms of a healthy policy, because neither in the USA nor in the EU dictatorship there are rational rulers.
I can agree with everything you say. Unfortunately, it is also a fact that very elderly people who have experienced the last World War in some impressive way, the present populations of the USA, Germany and the EU dictatorship, etc., only experience war from a distance, as through television, radio, and newspapers. Consequently, they themselves are not affected by it. As a result, however, they behave very indifferently, uninvolved, and can simply switch off their thoughts and feelings without taking responsibility themselves to do something about it. In fact, the majority of this population does nothing, but simply allows the powerful and other state officials, etc., who wage wars to do so. But it would be easy for the peoples in even halfway free states to take to the streets and demonstrate for peace, just as it would be easy to awaken the indifferent and all people in general from their lethargy with useful writings and to teach them the effective reality and its truth. But it must also be the case that pressure is exerted on politicians who are unable to govern, so that they begin to think and act logically, to shed their desire for power, to lead the peoples correctly to freedom and peace, and to protect them from war. And that is precisely what is at the forefront today as a result of the criminal and even criminal machinations of the United States and the EU dictatorship, which is why the peoples concerned must themselves tackle it before it is too late. And if nothing is done by the peoples themselves, and the greedy for state power continue to be left in the hands of the power-hungry, and nothing is done against their power-hungry behavior and their war-agitating machinations, then a fourth world war will actually come about. But that would mean that, as ever, the civilian population would be the one to suffer, because in the so-called normal case, only 12 to 15 civilians are killed for every dead soldier. But this is multiplied by the use of weapons of mass destruction. And if this danger is not averted, then the worst is to be feared. However, this can only be averted if the criminal and criminal machinations and the warmongering of the USA and the EU dictatorship against Russia are stopped as quickly as possible.
but the corresponding power-hungry criminal gangs will certainly not get involved in this.
Which is likely to be the case, but the question of what will emerge from the whole remains open. Everything is still open and unclear, which is why an exact forecast cannot yet be made, and a clear assessment of the future situation cannot yet be made. But now, Edward, I have to end our conversation because there is another obligation that I have to fulfill. So if you do not have anything important to discuss?
No, I did not. Well, goodbye, Pa, dear friend.
Goodbye, which will be in about 14 days, if there is nothing of importance to be discussed until then. Goodbye, Edward.